The dwelling looked like a grave waiting for a body. That's what people said when they saw what Jozef Novak was digging on the Kansas prairie in the summer of 1874. While every other homesteader was building cabins above ground, stacking logs or sod into walls that reached for the sky, Jozef was going down, digging into the earth like some kind of burrowing animal, creating what looked less like a home and more like a hole in the ground. They called it Novak's Pit. They said he was building his own tomb. Some suggested the immigrant Bohemian didn't understand that Americans built up, not down. Others whispered that maybe Jozef was preparing for death, digging his grave in advance, planning to just lie down in it when winter came. The consensus was clear and cruel. Jozef Novak was either insane or suicidal, and probably both. Jozef just kept digging, day after day, foot after foot into the Kansas prairie earth, moving dirt in a way that seemed to have no purpose anyone could understand. His neighbors watched from a distance, shaking their heads, convinced they were witnessing a man's descent into madness, literally. What they were actually witnessing was the construction of an earth-sheltered dwelling, a dugout, based on techniques Jozef had learned in Bohemia and seen perfected by Czech settlers in other parts of the plains. A structure that would use the earth itself as insulation, shelter, and thermal mass. A home that worked with the land rather than sitting on top of it. A dwelling that would prove more comfortable and more efficient than any above-ground cabin in the entire county. But his neighbors didn't know any of this. They just saw a man digging a hole, a big hole, a hole that kept getting deeper, and they laughed. Jozef Novak was 36 years old, a Czech immigrant who'd arrived in America 3 years earlier. He'd worked on a farm in Iowa before filing his homestead claim in Kansas. He was compact, muscular from years of physical labor, and quiet. His English was functional but heavily accented, which made some settlers dismiss him as simple. But Jozef was anything but simple. He carried knowledge from a culture that had been building earth-sheltered dwellings for centuries. In Bohemia, in the hill country where Jozef grew up, some families still lived in partially underground homes. These structures, called zemnis or bordai, dated back to medieval times or earlier. They were built by digging into hillsides or into the ground, creating living spaces that were naturally insulated by the surrounding earth. Cool in summer, warm in winter, protected from wind and weather. Practical and efficient. Jozef had also learned from other Czech settlers he'd met in Iowa. They described the dugouts that pioneers built on the treeless plains. When lumber was scarce or non-existent, you built with what was available, and what was available was earth. Dig into it, create walls from it, roof over it, live in it. It wasn't pretty by conventional standards, but it worked. The Kansas prairie where Jozef filed his claim was typical of the region. Flat, treeless, windy, beautiful in its vast openness, but brutal in its climate extremes. Summer temperatures could exceed 100 degrees. Winter could drop to 30 below zero. The wind never stopped. Spring brought tornadoes. This was not forgiving land. Most homesteaders built sod houses, cutting blocks of prairie sod and stacking them like bricks to form walls above ground. Sod houses worked reasonably well, though they leaked in rain, harbored insects, and required constant maintenance. A few settlers hauled lumber from distant railheads and built frame cabins. These were drier but less insulated and expensive to construct. Jozef planned something different. He would build down into the earth, creating a dwelling that was mostly underground. The earth would be his insulation, his wind protection, his thermal mass. He would work with the natural properties of the soil rather than fighting against the elements with thin walls that separated inside from outside by mere inches. The site he chose was on a gentle south-facing slope. This was critical. The south face would be exposed, allowing for a door and windows to bring in light and winter sun. The north, east, and west sides would be buried in earth, protected from the harsh north winds and sheltered by the thermal mass of the soil. The slope meant he could dig horizontally into the hill rather than digging straight down, making construction easier and drainage better. He began digging in June of 1874. The soil was prairie clay mixed with loam, perfect for his purposes, cohesive enough to hold a vertical face without immediately collapsing, dense enough to provide good thermal mass. He started by excavating a rectangular room approximately 14 feet by 20 feet, digging 8 feet into the hillside. The floor was dug to a depth where Jozef knew the earth temperature stayed constant year-round. He didn't know the scientific term frost line, but he understood the concept. Below a certain depth, the ground doesn't freeze in winter and stays cool in summer. The temperature remained stable at around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface conditions. This constant temperature was the key to everything. His nearest neighbor, a settler named William Crawford, whose claim bordered Jozef's to the west, rode over in late June to see what the Bohemian was doing. He found Jozef in a hole about 5 feet deep, still digging. Crawford sat on his horse looking down into the excavation with disbelief. "Novak, what in the name of heaven are you doing?" Jozef looked up from his digging. "Building house." Crawford frowned. "You're digging a hole. That's not building. That's grave digging." Jozef shook his head. "Not grave. Is house. Underground house. Very warm in winter, very cool in summer." Crawford laughed. "You can't live underground like some kind of animal. People live in houses. Houses with walls and roofs, above ground." Jozef leaned on his shovel. "In my country, some people build in earth. Is good. Works very well. Earth keeps temperature steady. No need for much heat in winter. No heat from sun in summer." Crawford shook his head. "Novak, I don't know what they do in Bohemia, but in America we build proper houses. You're wasting your time digging a hole. When winter comes, you'll freeze to death in your dirt cave." Jozef smiled slightly. "We will see." Crawford rode away shaking his head. The story spread quickly. That Bohemian settler is digging himself a hole to live in, says he's building a house underground. Must be touched in the head. Within a week, Jozef's excavation had become local entertainment. Homesteaders would ride by to see the crazy Czech and his hole. Some brought their families to gawk. Children peered into the growing excavation, wondering what it was for. Adults made jokes. Is he hiding from Indians? Is he digging for gold? Is he planning to hibernate like a bear? Jozef ignored the mockery and continued working. By mid-July, he'd excavated the full room, 8 feet deep into the hillside, 14 feet wide, 20 feet from front to back. The walls were raw earth, slightly sloped inward for stability. The floor was packed earth, level and smooth. It looked like nothing more than a rectangular hole, a cellar without a house above it. But Jozef's work was far from finished. He began building the front wall, the only wall that wouldn't be earth. He gathered flat stones from a nearby creek and built a sturdy stone wall across the front of the excavation. This wall was 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet at the top. He left openings for a door and 2 small windows. The stone wall would support the roof and provide thermal mass on the south side. Then came the roof. This was critical. The roof had to be strong enough to support earth covering while not requiring internal posts that would interfere with living space. Jozef used cottonwood logs he'd hauled from the creek bottom, the only timber available for 50 miles. He laid thick logs across the span from the stone front wall to the earthen back wall. Over the logs he placed a layer of brush and grass, then a thick layer of prairie sod, grass side down. On top of the sod, he added 2 feet of earth, 2 feet of soil that would provide insulation, thermal mass, and protection. The weight was enormous, several tons, but the thick logs supported it. The earth covering the roof meant the structure was buried on all sides except the front. It looked from the outside like a small stone wall built into a hillside with grass and flowers growing on top. You could walk over it and barely know a dwelling existed beneath. By mid-August, the basic structure was complete. Jozef built a wooden door and installed it in the stone wall. He covered the window openings with greased paper, the poor man's glass. Inside, he built shelves into the earthen walls, carved alcoves for storage, and created a sleeping platform along one wall. A small stone fireplace was built into the front wall, more for cooking than for heating. The interior was dim, lit only by the two small windows and whatever light came through the door. It smelled of earth, cool and damp and primordial. The ceiling was low, about 6.5 feet at the highest point. The walls were raw dirt, rough and organic. To anyone accustomed to conventional houses, it looked primitive, uncomfortable, uninhabitable. William Crawford visited the finished dugout in late August. Jozef invited him inside. Crawford had to stoop to enter through the low door. Inside, he stood in the dim, earth-walled room and looked around with visible discomfort. "This is where you plan to live? Through the winter?" Jozef nodded. "Yes, is very good." "You see how cool it is now," Crawford had noticed. Despite the August heat outside, approaching 95 degrees, the interior of the dugout was notably cool, maybe 65 degrees. The difference was striking. "It's cool now," Crawford admitted, "but that's because you're underground. When winter comes, it'll be cold and damp and miserable. You'll freeze." Jozef shook his head. Earth temperature below ground is always same, always about 55 degrees. In summer, this is cooler than outside. In winter, this is warmer than outside. Earth is like blanket, keeps temperature steady. Crawford didn't understand. Temperature can't be the same all year. That makes no sense. Jozef tried to explain. Deep in ground below the frost, the earth is not affected by surface temperature, is always steady. This dwelling is surrounded by earth. The earth keeps it from getting too hot or too cold. Crawford left, unconvinced, certain Jozef would regret his underground home when the harsh Kansas winter arrived. September and October brought more visitors, more mockery. The consensus was firm. Novak's hole was the worst dwelling anyone had seen, dark, damp, primitive, a hole in the ground with a door. The man would never make it through winter. Some predicted he'd abandon the dugout and build a proper sod house. Others thought he'd simply freeze to death in his earth cave. What none of them understood was the science behind what Jozef had built. The earth surrounding his dugout had enormous thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and release heat. The tons of earth surrounding the dwelling absorbed heat very slowly in summer and lost heat very slowly in winter. This created a thermal buffer that stabilized interior temperature. More importantly, at the depth where Jozef's dwelling existed, the earth maintained a nearly constant temperature year-round. This phenomenon is due to the Earth's thermal inertia. Surface temperature swings from summer heat to winter cold penetrate only a few feet into the ground. Below the frost line, typically 4 to 6 feet deep in Kansas, the ground temperature remains remarkably stable, fluctuating only a few degrees throughout the year. In Kansas, this stable ground temperature is approximately 53 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Jozef's dugout, surrounded on 3 sides and above by earth at this depth, was thermally coupled to that constant temperature. No matter what happened on the surface, the earth surrounding his home wanted to stay at 55 degrees. This meant the interior would naturally gravitate toward that temperature. In summer, when surface temperatures reached 100 degrees, the dugout stayed cool at around 60 to 65 degrees. The earth absorbed the day's heat so slowly that it never reached the interior. In winter, when surface temperatures dropped below zero, the dugout would stay relatively warm at around 50 to 55 degrees. The earth released stored heat so slowly that the cold never fully penetrated. This principle had been used for millennia. Root cellars used it to keep food cool in summer, and prevent freezing in winter. Earth-sheltered dwellings across cultures, from ancient pit houses to medieval zemnis to Native American earth lodges, all exploited this natural temperature stability. November arrived with falling temperatures. The first frost came early on November 8th. By Thanksgiving, snow covered the prairie. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees at night. Homesteaders lit their fires, burned their precious fuel, fought to keep their cabins warm. The struggle against winter had begun. In Jozef's dugout, life was different. He lit a small fire most evenings, primarily for cooking and for light. The fire raised the interior temperature to perhaps 62 or 65 degrees, comfortable with warm clothing. When the fire died, the temperature slowly settled back toward the Earth's constant temperature of 55 degrees. Even with no fire at all, the dugout never got truly cold. 55 degrees was cool but livable, especially with blankets and warm clothing. Crawford stopped by in early December, curious how Jozef was surviving. He knocked on the low door, and Jozef invited him in. Crawford stepped from the bitter December air, 15 degrees with a harsh wind, into the dugout. The temperature shift was immediate. It felt warm. He stood in the dim interior, confused. "You have a fire going?" He looked at the fireplace. Cold ashes, no fire. "How is it warm in here with no fire?" Jozef gestured to the walls around them. "The earth." "I told you, earth temperature stays same, always about 55 degrees. Right now outside is 15 degrees, and here is 55 degrees, 40 degrees warmer with no fire." Crawford pulled out his pocket thermometer. He'd brought it specifically to check Jozef's claims. He let it stabilize. 54 degrees. Outside had been 14 degrees when he left his cabin. A 40-degree differential with no heat source. How is this possible? The ground can't be warm when the air is this cold, Jozef tried to explain. Ground below the surface is not same temperature as air. Ground has big thermal mass. Changes temperature very slow. By the time cold from surface reaches deep ground, is already spring and getting warm again. Deep ground temperature is average of whole year. Summer and winter average is about 55 degrees. This dwelling is in the deep ground. So is always about 55 degrees. Crawford was beginning to understand, but it still seemed like magic. "Your walls are dirt. Dirt should be cold." Jozef smiled. "Walk outside and dig hole 3 feet deep. Put your hand in bottom of hole. Ground is warmer than air, yes?" Crawford nodded slowly. He'd dug enough fence post holes to know this was true. Even in winter, the ground below the surface felt warmer than the air. He'd never thought about why. Same principle, but more. This dwelling is 8 feet into earth, completely surrounded except front. All that earth is like big warm blanket. Keeps cold out, keeps warmth in. Temperature stays steady. Crawford left shaking his head, not in mockery this time, but in wonder. He told others what he'd experienced. "Novak's hole is warm. I measured it myself. 54 degrees inside, with no fire. 14 degrees outside. The dirt is keeping him warm." Some settlers dismissed this as impossible. Others were intrigued. A few made their own visits to verify. Each visitor confirmed the same thing. The dugout maintained a stable, livable temperature with minimal or no heating. The earth itself was providing all the thermal regulation needed. December brought colder weather. Temperatures dropped to 0, then 10 below. Sod houses and frame cabins required constant fires. Families burned cord after cord of precious fuel hauled from distant creek bottoms or purchased at enormous cost. They struggled to keep interior temperatures above freezing. Frost formed on interior walls. Water buckets froze overnight despite fires burning constantly. Jozef burned perhaps 1/10 the fuel his neighbors used. A small fire in the evening for cooking and comfort. No fire overnight, no fire during the day. The dugout maintained its steady 55 degrees, cool by modern standards, but far warmer than unheated cabins that would quickly drop to exterior temperatures. With proper clothing and blankets, 55 degrees was perfectly livable. January 1875 brought the real test. A cold wave settled over Kansas, driven by Arctic air from the north. On January 19th, the temperature dropped to 38 below zero, 38 below. The coldest temperature recorded in the region up to that time. This was survival-threatening cold, cold that killed livestock, cold that froze inadequately protected people. In cabins across the prairie, conditions became desperate. William Crawford's sod house, with a fire roaring constantly, struggled to maintain 18 degrees inside. His family wore every piece of clothing they owned, huddled together for warmth, and still shivered. They burned furniture when their firewood ran low. The walls radiated cold. Ice formed on the ceiling. It was survivable, but barely. A frame cabin 3 miles south, occupied by a family named Morrison, failed completely. The family abandoned it when the interior temperature dropped to zero despite a fire. They loaded into their wagon and fled to the town of Junction City, 20 miles away. They nearly froze during the journey, but staying in the cabin would have killed them. Other families suffered frostbite, respiratory illness from breathing frozen air, and the psychological trauma of being unable to get warm despite desperate efforts. The cold wave lasted 4 days. 4 days of brutal, life-threatening temperatures that tested every structure and every decision made in warmer months. In Jozef's dugout, the temperature was 54 degrees, with no fire. The earth surrounding the dwelling simply didn't care what was happening on the surface. 38 below outside? The earth 8 feet down was still 54 degrees. The laws of physics were clear. Heat moves from warm to cold. The surface was desperately cold. The deep earth was stable and relatively warm. The dugout, embedded in that stable earth, maintained the earth's temperature. Jozef lived through the cold wave in relative comfort. He wore a wool shirt and jacket. He slept under blankets. He was cool, but never cold. He lit a small fire one evening just to raise the temperature a bit and to cook a meal. The fire brought the interior to 60 degrees. After it died, the temperature slowly drifted back to 55 over several hours. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth acted as a battery, absorbing the fire's heat and releasing it gradually. If you're amazed by this survival knowledge that literally kept people alive in killing cold, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We explore forgotten techniques and wisdom that made survival possible when modern technology didn't exist. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. On January 23rd, when the cold wave finally broke and temperatures rose to a comparatively balmy 0 degrees, William Crawford made his way to Jozef's dugout. He had to see how the Bohemian had fared. He found Jozef outside, working on repairing a fence, wearing just a wool coat, looking healthy and relaxed. Crawford dismounted. "How did you survive?" "My family barely made it. We burned everything we could and still nearly froze." Jozef invited him inside the dugout. Crawford entered. It was warm, the same steady temperature it had been in December. He pulled out his thermometer. 53 degrees. Outside was now 0. A 53-degree differential. "You had no fire during the cold wave, when it was 38 below?" Jozef shook his head. "No fire needed. Earth keeps temperature steady. I was comfortable." Crawford sat down on Jozef's wooden chair, stunned. "Do you understand what you have here? Do you understand that you've survived the worst cold we've ever seen, with no fuel, no fire, nothing but dirt keeping you warm?" Jozef nodded. "I tried to tell people. Earth-sheltered dwelling works very well, is old knowledge. My people have known this for many generations." Crawford looked around the dim, earth-walled interior with new eyes. "This isn't a hole in the ground. This is the smartest building in the county." Jozef smiled. Now maybe people will believe. The story spread like wildfire. Novak's dugout stayed 50 degrees during the cold wave. No fire, no fuel. The man was comfortable while we nearly froze. Settlers began visiting in groups. Jozef welcomed them all, explained the principles, showed them his dwelling. The mockery had completely reversed. The man they'd called crazy was now called brilliant. By February, 3 other homesteaders had begun digging their own dugouts. By spring, 7 more were under construction. Jozef helped them all, advising on depth, orientation, roof construction, drainage. He freely shared everything he knew. The technique spread rapidly through the Kansas homesteading community. The dugout builders all reported similar results. Stable interior temperatures year-round. 50 to 55 degrees with no heating in winter, 60 to 65 degrees with no cooling in summer, dramatic fuel savings compared to above-ground dwellings. Better protection from tornadoes, which were common on the plains. Lower construction costs, since earth was free and timber was scarce. Not everyone adopted the technique. Some settlers couldn't overcome their psychological resistance to living underground. It felt like living in a cave, like being buried. The darkness bothered them. The smell of earth was oppressive. They preferred above-ground dwellings, even if they were less efficient. Others tried dugouts and discovered problems Jozef had warned about. Poor drainage led to flooding during heavy rains. Inadequate roof support led to collapses. Too shallow construction failed to reach the constant temperature zone, resulting in dugouts that still got cold in winter. Building a good dugout required knowledge and care. Done wrong, it was miserable. Done right, it was revolutionary. William Crawford built his own dugout in the summer of 1875. He consulted with Jozef on every detail: proper depth, south-facing orientation, strong roof, good drainage. When finished, his dugout was larger than Jozef's, about 20 by 24 feet, with 2 rooms. The Crawford family moved in that fall. The difference in their winter experience was dramatic. No more desperate struggle to stay warm, no more burning excessive firewood. The steady temperature meant they could relax, knowing the dwelling would maintain livable conditions regardless of outside weather. Crawford's wife, Sarah, who'd been most resistant to the idea, became the dugout's biggest advocate. She told other women, "You have no idea how much easier winter is when you're not constantly freezing." A journalist from a Topeka newspaper visited the region in 1876 to write about the dugout phenomenon. He interviewed Jozef and several other dugout residents. His article, published in April 1876, was titled "The Underground Homesteaders: How Czech Wisdom is Transforming Prairie Living." The article spread awareness beyond Kansas, influencing settlers in Nebraska, the Dakotas, and other plains regions. The scientific explanation for the dugout's performance was understood intuitively by builders, even if they didn't know the formal terminology. The Earth has high thermal mass and low thermal conductivity. It stores lots of heat, but releases it slowly. Below the frost line, seasonal temperature swings from the surface are dampened to almost nothing. The result is a nearly constant temperature year-round. Modern measurements confirm what Jozef knew from experience. At depths of 6 to 8 feet, soil temperature in Kansas averages 53 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, fluctuating only 2 to 3 degrees seasonally. This stable temperature creates a perfect buffer zone for human habitation. Cool enough to be pleasant in summer, warm enough to prevent freezing in winter. The R value, a modern measure of thermal resistance, of 8 feet of earth is approximately R10 to R15, depending on soil moisture and composition. But more important than R value is thermal mass. The tons of earth surrounding a dugout act as a huge thermal battery. They resist temperature change. They average out daily and seasonal fluctuations. They create stability. This principle is used in modern earth shelter architecture. Contemporary earth-integrated homes achieve heating and cooling energy savings of 50 to 70% compared to conventional construction. Passive annual heat storage systems use similar principles, storing summer heat in earth for winter use and winter cold for summer use. The physics haven't changed since Jozef's time. The environmental sustainability of dugouts was significant. Minimal fuel use meant minimal deforestation. No need to haul timber from distant sources. Construction used local materials, soil and stone. The structures blended into the landscape, creating minimal visual impact. They were inherently sustainable long before sustainability became a concept. Durability was another advantage. Well-built dugouts lasted decades with minimal maintenance. The earth walls didn't rot or require painting. The roof, if properly constructed with adequate earth cover, was protected from weather. Some dugouts built in the 1870s remained functional into the 1920s, 50 years of service. The psychological aspect of dugout living was complex. Some people loved it. The constant temperature, the protection from storms, the quiet, insulated from prairie wind, the coziness of a small, earth-wrapped space. Others hated it, the darkness, the dampness, the feeling of being underground, the lack of views, the claustrophobia. It was deeply personal. Children raised in dugouts had mixed memories. Some recalled the dugout fondly as warm and safe. Others remembered it as dark and limiting. Most acknowledged that whatever the aesthetic drawbacks, the dugout had kept their families alive during brutal winters when others suffered. Jozef lived in his dugout until 1892, 18 years. It served him well through every winter, every summer, every storm. He eventually built a frame house above ground, having saved enough money to afford lumber. But he kept the dugout and used it as a root cellar and storm shelter. The steady temperature was perfect for storing food. The earth covering made it tornado-proof. He married in 1881 a Czech woman named Anna, who'd come to Kansas with her family. They raised 4 children, first in the dugout, then in the frame house. Jozef became a respected member of the community, known for his knowledge of earth-sheltered construction. He helped dozens of families build their own dugouts over the years. Subscribe to this channel to discover more forgotten survival techniques and building wisdom that's incredibly relevant today. From frontier innovations to ancient knowledge, we explore the practical skills that made life possible in impossible conditions. Don't miss the next story. Hit subscribe now. The dugout building boom on the plains lasted from roughly 1870 to 1895. Thousands of dugouts were constructed during this period. They served as first homes for many homesteaders, providing shelter while families established themselves and saved money for above-ground houses. Some remained permanent homes for families who appreciated their unique advantages. By the early 1900s, dugouts had fallen out of favor. Prosperity allowed more families to afford frame houses. Social pressure pushed people toward conventional housing. Living underground came to be seen as a sign of poverty or failure. The dugout, which had been a practical solution to harsh conditions, became stigmatized, but the knowledge persisted in places. Native communities on the plains had always used earth lodges, similar structures with similar principles. Some Czech, German, and Scandinavian communities continued building earth-sheltered root cellars and storm shelters. The recognition that earth provided thermal stability never completely disappeared. The Great Depression of the 1930s saw a brief resurgence of dugout construction. Desperate families unable to afford conventional housing returned to earth sheltering. Some of these Depression-era dugouts were remarkably sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from earlier generations. They demonstrated that the technique remained viable when economic conditions demanded efficiency. The energy crisis of the 1970s sparked renewed interest in earth-sheltered housing. Architects and builders began seriously studying thermal earth sheltering as an energy-efficient building strategy. Modern earth-sheltered homes using contemporary materials but traditional principles proliferated. The movement demonstrated that Jozef's approach wasn't obsolete. it had just been forgotten. Modern earth-sheltered architecture confirms everything Jozef understood intuitively. The passive house standard, the living building challenge, and other high-performance building frameworks all recognize earth coupling as a valuable thermal strategy. Contemporary builders use computer modeling to optimize what Jozef did by instinct and experience. The story of Jozef's dugout teaches lessons beyond building technology. It's about the value of traditional knowledge from diverse cultures, about the wisdom of working with nature rather than fighting it, about the courage to do what works even when everyone mocks you, about the importance of understanding basic principles rather than just following conventional practice. Jozef faced relentless mockery for building his hole in the ground. His neighbors thought he was insane, thought he was digging his own grave, thought he would die in his earth cave when winter came. They couldn't imagine that going down instead of up could be the better choice. Their mental model of shelter was walls reaching skyward. Jozef's model was embedding in the Earth's constant temperature zone until the test came, until January 1875 brought 38 below zero, until cabins froze and families suffered, while Jozef sat comfortably at 54 degrees with no fire. Until the evidence became undeniable that the hole in the ground outperformed every conventional dwelling in the county. Until survival in impossible cold proved that the crazy Czech had been right all along. The differential was staggering: 38 below outside, 54 above inside. A 92-degree difference with zero fuel consumption. While neighbors burned furniture and nearly froze, Jozef was comfortable in his earth-wrapped sanctuary. The physics were straightforward. The earth didn't care about surface temperature. The dugout, coupled to the earth's constant temperature, remained stable and livable. They laughed at his hole in the ground. They called it a grave, called it a cave, called it the dwelling of a madman. They couldn't understand how anyone could live underground like an animal, until the killing cold came, until their above-ground cabins failed, until they realized that the man in the hole was the only one who truly understood survival on the plains, because he knew something they didn't. He knew the earth was a thermal battery. He knew that below the surface, temperature was constant. He knew that surrounding a dwelling with thermal mass created stability. He knew that working with natural principles beat fighting against them. And he had the courage to dig down when everyone else built up. The hole in the ground wasn't a grave. It was genius. The earth walls weren't primitive. They were sophisticated passive temperature control. The dwelling everyone mocked was the most thermally efficient structure in the county. And the man they called crazy was the wisest builder on the prairie. Jozef's dugout survived minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit without heat. Not barely survived, thrived, maintained comfortable temperatures through the worst cold in regional history, protected its occupant when others suffered. Proved that sometimes the strangest solution is the smartest solution, that sometimes going down is the way up, that sometimes a hole in the ground is the finest dwelling you could build. The neighbors laughed until the blizzard hit, until the cold came, until they froze while Jozef stayed warm, until the earth proved to be the best insulation, the best thermal mass, the best shelter available, until the hole they'd mocked became the model they copied. Because survival doesn't care about appearances, survival only cares about what works. And Jozef Novak's hole in the ground worked better than anything else when it mattered most.